welcome everybody to the 20th webinar of the EMAP Hub. I am saying a few words on behalf of our Hub manager who cannot be with us here. His name is José Luis Canellas, maybe you know him. And we have 4 colleagues, they're all marked with KIX EMAP. Marina Dreux-Frotté, Yasmina based in Cairo, and Veronika Musolova based in Geneva. Let me just say a few words on the KIX project. KIX stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. So the X is the exchange part. And it is a 7-year project funded by GPE, Global Partnership for Education, through IDRC, International Development Research Center based in Ottawa. Now, KIX has 2 parts. One is hubs. We have 4 hubs, 4 regional hubs that work directly with policymakers, policy analysts, education researchers, and it's all about supporting them in what we say surfacing, amplifying, and dissemination of policy knowledge from GPE partner countries. So our job as a hub, and we are the hub for 36 countries, our job is to make you heard and your expertise heard. And we have learning cycles. Actually, we have 2 coming up. You might want to check out the KIX EMAP Hub, which are peer exchange opportunities. You can look up everything that we do. We are one of 4. There is also 1 hub in Eastern Southern Africa, 1 in West Africa, and 1 in Latin America. So we are the hub. And then KIX also has research projects that they fund. And these are applied research projects, and ROSIE is one of them, one of the big ones, based at Brookings institution in Washington, D.C., and they are supporting other applied KIX research on scaling innovation. So this is to explain in a nutshell how these 2, we are all KIX funded, but we have different functions. So this is bringing together the best of 2 worlds, the hubs, the hub, and the research projects, all by KIX funded. We follow the usual format. We have it very interactive. We have a mixture of presentations, Q&A, and discussion, and a panel discussion. So maybe one last word on NORAG. NORAG is the organization that hosts the hub, the KIX EMAP Hub, and EMAP stands for Europe, Middle East and Northern Africa, Asia, and Pacific. NORAG is celebrating, I hope we're celebrating next year, the 50th anniversary. It's an old institution. We see ourselves as doing critical development work, development studies, development work from a critical perspective, one that believes in knowledge equity between the global north and global south. And that's why we are very excited to have the KIX Hub, because it's exactly down the mission, what we believe in. So I think I've said enough about NORAG and KIX and Brookings. So let me just say a few words on the agenda. I'm extremely pleased to have a mixture of colleagues, both from at Brookings and from colleagues that work on research projects. So we will have first an input by Molly Curtis-Weiss. She's Senior Project Manager and Senior Research Analyst at Brookings at the Center for Universal Education. And then we have a round of Q&A. And as Veronica says, please put in your questions, your comments in the chat. Then Brad Olson, he's the Senior Fellow also at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. He will give us an input on the key scaling themes of the ROSIE project. Again, Q&A, and afterwards, moderated by Brad, we have a very interesting panel with 2 panelists, 1 colleague, Gembo Tsering. He is based in Bhutan at the Royal University of Bhutan. He is the lead investigator of a project. And we have Binayak Thapa, based in Nepal at Kathmandu University. He's also a principal investigator of one of the KIX projects. Then we have, I give the floor then at the Marina will do the closing remarks. I think I've said enough, and I'm very happy to pass the floor now to Molly Curtis-Weiss, who will give you an introduction on the topic.
Thank you so much,
Molly.
and I'm delighted to be here with everyone today. As she said, I'm just going to give a brief overview of why we're talking about scaling for impact and how we define it and how we think about it, and sort of set the stage for the rest of this discussion. So thank you for sharing the slides. If you would just advance maybe a couple of slides. Yeah, we don't need the agenda. Perfect. So I can just briefly introduce where we're from. Brad and myself and our colleague Maya work at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, which is a public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. So the Center for Universal Education is part of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings, which focuses on developing and disseminating effective solutions for quality education and skills development. And we work closely with networks of partners around the world to accelerate education progress and systems change so that all learners, especially the most marginalized, can develop a breadth of skills to thrive in a rapidly changing world. So if we just want to go to the next slide. First, why are we talking about scaling? As many of you already know, we know that many effective innovations work at a small scale, but this often doesn't translate to the large-scale systemic change that's needed to really improve learning around the world. So one of our colleagues estimates that of all the innovations piloted, more than 90% fail to scale and be sustained. And that's not because they weren't good innovations or effective, but for many other reasons. And this matters because it contributes to the project mindset that fails to create lasting change in education systems. And so that's why we're interested in learning more about this topic and how scaling happens. Please go to the next slide. So what do we mean by scaling? I think we've seen that if we were talking to 10 people in a room, each person would have their own definition of how they think about scaling. So for us at Brookings, we define scaling as a range of different approaches. It could be deliberate replication, organic diffusion, integration into national systems, but they're all focused on expanding and deepening impact that leads to lasting improvement in people's lives. And it's important to distinguish this from simply expanding a particular project or transferring it to different contexts. So here, quality, equity, and sustainability are really central to the definition. And this concept of scale really takes a systems approach where the focus is on enacting and managing a sustainable change in the broader system. And for us, scaling can pursue multiple paths. It can include having other actors adopt a program or model and implement it themselves. It can include institutionalizing that program into government policy or integrating elements of an approach into existing classroom practices. But again, the key element is really the focus is on scaling the impact of the initiative. So if you wouldn't mind changing to the next slide. And actually, if you just want to click through the 3 boxes, perfect. So just to go a little bit more into our understanding of scaling, our research and the research of others has shown that it's not enough to simply identify effective education innovations and then work to expand them to more people in some technical copy and paste way or following a preset plan. So firstly, we've learned that scaling is really a non-linear process. It requires ongoing reflection, adaptation, and course correction in response to data collected, lessons learned, changes happening in the broader education ecosystem, and it necessitates collaborative partnership, flexible adaptation, and really a shared vision to scale and sustain impact. As I mentioned, scaling also demands a systems approach that takes into account local contexts as well as national systems, political environments, resource constraints, and the capabilities of all the different actors involved. And there, as I had mentioned, of course, there are multiple pathways to scale, and we think it's important to underscore that these are not mutually exclusive. So figuring out which pathway will be pursued involves determining who will deliver this innovation as it's scaling, and then once it's at scale, who will pay for it as it's scaling and once it's at scale, what methods will be pursued to achieve the ultimate goal, and how these roles will transition among actors over time. Finally, we've said this, but it's worth repeating one more time. The ultimate goal, of course, is expanding and sustaining outcomes, not growing a particular project. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. It's easy to think about scaling really as bigger is always better, but that's not necessarily the case. So the IDRC, and some of you may be familiar with this already, developed this notion of optimal scale, which is a fundamentally different way to think about scaling. So this slide includes 4 dimensions of optimal scale. These aren't the only possible dimensions, but there are a few important ones to keep in mind. So the first one is the magnitude. That's the usual consideration related to scaling. How much coverage, how many students, how many regions. But then it's complemented by these other dimensions. So variety is looking at the different kind of impacts that are being counted. Equity is looking at who specifically is benefiting from these impacts and who is excluded. And then sustainability is looking at the lastingness of impact. Will it last beyond this particular project and this particular funding stream? And if you just click, you can see that this slide has knobs next to each of these dimensions. It is tempting to say that we want to turn all of these knobs up on high, but we know that in real life, time, capacity, resources, everything is limited. We almost never have time to do everything simultaneously equally. And so we have to consider and accept trade-offs. And as a result, this means we need to clearly, transparently, and intentionally consider these different dimensions and how we intend to balance them, because we can't do all of them to the maximum. So I'll just conclude on this next slide by touching briefly on the relationship between scaling and systems transformation, which we think is an important one. For a long time, in the scaling literature, those who work on scaling, there's been some debate about the extent to which scaling efforts should engage with systems constraints and whether systems change rather than scaling should really be where we start for reform. So this is a continuum put forth in a paper by Richard Cole. And for us, it shows that rather than see these as conflicting views, it's important to see scaling and systems transformation as complementary processes that sit on a continuum of large-scale change. Scaling can, it's sort of on the one side come from with a systems perspective, and the other go all the way to broad systems change. But scaling can leverage the system to embed its innovation into sustained use at the same time as it transforms the system for exponentially improved learning outcomes. So let me pause there, and we can see if there are any questions before we dive a little bit more into our findings about scaling.
Thank you, Molly. So far, I think everyone was hearing very attentively the presentation. And no questions were coming in, but now I see a few are coming. So the first one is from Andy Smart, who asks, have the 90% of examples that have not worked also followed these frameworks and criteria? And this is Andy Smart from nissan.org.
Not necessarily. I think that is from sort of looking at all innovations, all pilots that have been tested, that 90% of them fail to go to scale. And I think that's largely because the different considerations of scaling have not been taken into account. Okay. Let me, I see someone, Gita, ask for the link to this Cole paper, and I can find it quickly. And that has the details of what's in these different ovals. But quickly, just to say that the bottom, they're sort of the continuum of how much scaling and systems change are going together. So from one side, it's scaling, just taking the system into account. And then the other side, it's sort of working with system parts for holistic change.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Molly. I see that we're receiving some comments in Arabic. I don't know if I think the translation is coming for those. So just to make sure we are not missing any questions. Okay. All right, so maybe it's just a comment. I would suggest, yeah, we just received a comment from Dr. Zahid Majid from Pakistan saying that in different cultures and practice, meaning and perspective of scaling is different. So I think it's pretty much aligned with what you were mentioning in the beginning of the definition of scaling, right? And then Dr. Zahid is asking, how do we generalize it for all, especially for GPE KIX projects? So Dr. Zahid is involved in one of the KIX research projects, so just for context as well.
I think you're absolutely right that the meaning and idea of what scaling is different, and not just in different cultures, but between just different people. There's a lot of different conceptualizations of scaling. And I don't think that we would say that we need everyone to have exactly the same definition or understanding, but that it's more important within a collection of people working on a particular scaling initiative that they have clarity between them about what they mean about scaling, and that they are all on the same page by how they understand that and how they're going to pursue that. But I don't think that we need everyone to have the same definition necessarily, because there are so many different circumstances and contexts in which scaling is taking place. That being said, I do think the overall emphasis on impact rather than just numbers reached is an important distinction, because of course no one wants to spend our limited time and resources scaling something that doesn't work, and there are always risks if we aren't focused on impact that will grow a lot but lose the quality, the equity considerations.
Great. Thank you very much for clarifying that, Molly, for that additional insights. So I would suggest, in the interest of time, that we move over to our next presentation, which is from Brad Olsen, also from Brookings, on key scaling themes emerging from the ROSIE research project. And for all participants, if you have further questions, do include them in the chat, and we'll be able to address them in our next Q&A section coming up. Brad, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marina. Hello, everybody. I'm Brad Olsen. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. And along with Molly and our colleague Maya and others, we lead the ROSIE project. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But I'd also like to thank the KIX EMAP for hosting this webinar. And I want to thank Gita for offering some introductory remarks. We're really honored to have the chance to talk a little bit about our work here, and we look forward to engaging with you all. And so please do offer some questions along the way that we'll take up at the end of this particular aspect of the presentation. And then we hope that there might be a little bit of time for some back and forth in the chat during and after the panel discussion that follows my presentation. The ROSIE project has been supporting and studying scaling for 4 years now. And as a result, we've got many briefs and reports and blogs and tools for you to use. Please, I hope that you'll look them up today, because today I only have a chance to offer a few broad highlights, but I'll go ahead and do that now. Next slide, please. The ROSIE project, ROSIE is an acronym for Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovations in Education. And as Gita mentioned, we're part of the KIX, the GPE KIX initiative, which is a partnership of KIX and, a partnership between GPE and IDRC. And since 2020, we've been working on and supporting and studying scaling within the KIX initiative. As Gita mentioned, there are the hubs as a part of the KIX initiative, and there are the many KIX applied research grantees. And then there's also ROSIE. What we in ROSIE do is really try and support and learn alongside the grantees as they engage in their scaling and research work, and then share and disseminate what we're learning both within the KIX initiative and more broadly to the global community. There are 3 mechanisms by which we do this. One of them is ROSIE offers a learning support community for the KIX grantees and their regional hubs. This is an opportunity that creates ongoing peer exchange where teams can get together and share their successes and their challenges, how they're going through the complexity of scaling, and really create a collaborative, supportive learning exchange community, both virtually and occasionally in person. The second mechanism is an ongoing collaborative research project in which we are learning alongside these KIX grantee teams. For the first round of work, we learned alongside 15 of the regional grantee teams, and now we're beginning to work with all of the KIX grantee teams that are coming on board. We engage in some collaborative research to learn what's working in scaling for these folks and how and under what conditions their scaling is succeeding, as well as what the challenges are. And then we share what we're learning back with the individual teams, with all of the teams, and with KIX as a whole, and then again, more broadly with the scaling community writ large. The third mechanism, or the third aspect of ROSIE, is complementary qualitative research that we have been engaging in. This first round of work over a couple of years, we focused on government decision-making at the national level around what kinds of innovations are adopted, adapted, and supported at scale. In other words, we wanted to better understand how government decision makers approach their decision-making process. We studied that in 8 different countries. We've written some reports about that. And now we're turning our focus to government decision-making at the middle level in several low and middle income countries. And so that means, what is it like above the school level, above the local level, but below the national level in terms of government decision-making and other kinds of support for scaling? And so I hope that you'll look forward and stay tuned to what we learn about that as we share it in a year or so. Next slide, please. Before we begin with what we've been learning lately, I want to share a few things that we already knew. In some ways, this builds on what Molly was talking about. We entered into ROSIE already having some clarity around principles of practice related to scaling. And what we learned is that a lot of these things turn out, in fact, to be true. We nuanced some of them and found them showing up in different ways with different scaling teams in different contexts. But I just very quickly want to mention that, one of the things that seems to be incredibly important is the need to plan for scaling from the beginning of an innovations process. In other words, even during design and development of the innovation, it's really important to begin to think about what scaling is going to look like. We find sometimes teams will wait until after the innovation has been designed and developed and even piloted before thinking about scaling. And we think that there's a higher likelihood of success if folks are thinking about the scaling dimensions of the work right from the beginning of the process. A second thing is the simplicity of the innovation seems to correlate in many cases with the ability for users to actually take up the innovation and for scaling to proceed successfully. There's a natural tendency we see for folks to make the innovation complex, to keep adding things to it. And we understand that. There's a desire to make sure that the innovation does an awful lot of good. But what we have found is that if there's the ability to focus on the core, the sort of special secret that makes the innovation potentially successful. And I think that it's important that we focus on that in a way that allows for simplicity and to focus just on the core of the innovation so that scaling will increase. And then finally, as Molly mentioned, it's not just the reach of the innovation that matters, it's the impact and the equity and the sustainability of the innovation. And so we think it's important that researchers collect and use data, not just on how many schools are participating, how many teachers are attending a program, but actually what are the effects and what is the impact over time of the innovation. Next slide, please. So those are some things that we already knew. These are some new things. And again, for details, I hope that you'll please read, watch, or listen to our work. But there are a few things that we learned recently from the work of having learned alongside several of the KIX grantee teams that I want to share. One of them is, and this picks up a little bit not only on Molly's point, but on Dr. Zahid's question, how important it is to collaboratively define and discuss key terms and concepts related to scaling at the beginning of the scaling journey. The word scaling means different things to different people. It translates differently across languages. Sometimes you'll have the same people in a room using the word scaling, but meaning very different things. And in some ways, understanding what scaling is and what it isn't is a core dimension of the work. And so we have found there's real value in groups taking on and working through terms like scaling, impact, sustainability, equity at the beginning of the work. It's not necessarily that everyone needs to have the same definition, but we do think it's important that there's some clarity and there are explicit conversations about what these words mean. A second thing is the importance of continual adaptation and changing the scaling process along the way. A successful scaling journey requires that. If one looks backwards at a successful scaling journey, one will see that it's not a straight line. It zigs, it zags, it loops up on itself. Sometimes it's a few steps forward and a few steps back. It's never clear. It's never particularly linear. It's never simple and technical. And so along the way, it becomes incredibly important that researchers and other scaling stakeholders collect and use data and understand where adaptations need to be made, and then study the effects of the adaptation to make sure that they are in line with the ultimate goals of the scaling pathway that's been chosen, or the pathways plural. Next slide, please. Another thing is we've learned that many of the teams within KIX have the scaling goal of getting government to take over their innovation. This is sometimes known as institutionalization. We've studied institutionalization from both the scaling team side of things and the government decision-making side of things. One thing we learned is that for scaling teams, there are some identified ingredients for success, some things that must be present if a government is going to look favorably at an innovation. And some things that, while they might not be absolutely necessary, are indeed important. And so you can see on this list that there are some things that seem to have to be present if a government is going to consider taking up and working with a scaling team to ultimately take over, to pay for, to deliver, and to build into the government infrastructure a particular innovation program or policy. It needs to have a favorable cost-benefit analysis. It needs to have been tailored for the specific location in which it's going to be implemented and scaled, and so on. Additionally, there are some ingredients that we found to be important, albeit not always necessary, for a government to consider a particular innovation or program positively. And that may include support from the international donor community. It seems to often require a strong Ministry of Education and a government infrastructure that's able to actually receive and support the implementation and the scaling. And so these are things that are important. There are other things that we've learned about it, including the importance for scaling researchers and scaling implementers to be able to think like decision makers. And we've written about that, but I don't think I have enough time right now to go into detail. I do think it's important that scaling researchers and scaling teams be clear about how government hierarchies work, know who the government gatekeeper is, understand that decision makers are negotiating with multiple constituencies and multiple ministries within government. They don't have an awful lot of time. They have to think about electoral politics. They have to think about their budgets. And so in many cases, the strength of the actual education innovation is a small part of the broader environment of government decision making. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Still, another thing that we learned recently is the importance of engaging champions in scaling. Now, that may not be new, but we've been able to really break that topic up and deconstruct it and analyze it in many ways. So we know that the importance of having some key champions on the side of the researchers and the scaling team is important. But what does that actually mean? A champion is an individual who's not part of the inner scaling team, but who can be enlisted to support and advance the scaling strategy in powerful ways. What we found, however, is that there are different kinds of champions available for scaling. We have delineated 6 of them. We have a brief about this. Please feel free to read it if you'd like. One kind of champion might be the person who's actually been through the innovation and had a very successful experience and wants to share its power with others. Another kind of champion is someone who cares deeply about the broader topic, maybe girls' education, or maybe rural education, or maybe using data systems to administrate schools. And in these cases, it's maybe not the innovation that's so important to the champion, but the broader topic. Still, another person might be someone who's familiar with and has worked with the organization that's behind the scaling and worked with them in the past and is a champion of the organization. And so it's important, next slide, please, to think about the fact that different champions need to be engaged in different ways and that they will be useful in different ways at different phases of the scaling journey. What this means for us is the importance of groups really doing the early work of thinking about what kinds of champions will be helpful, mapping the terrain to learn what champions are available, and thinking through what it means to engage particular champions at different times along the scaling journey. One of the things that we learned as well, this is letter A, is champions are not shortcuts to government adoption. One of the things that many of the KIX teams learned the hard way is that just because you get a champion in government to engage with and to support your innovation doesn't necessarily mean that magically the government is going to adopt and adapt and support the innovation. It's not that simple. Moving to letter C, we learned how important it is to be mindful of champions' time. You know, they're busy. We found that it's really important to be efficient in reaching out to them, to clearly prepare them for events, how important it is to recognize their efforts publicly. They're working hard on behalf of the innovation. They're typically not being paid. They're not getting anything directly out of it. And so it's really important to make sure that the relationship with champions is a reciprocal one and not a transactional one. In other words, thinking through what the champions might be able to gain from the arrangement and not only what the scaling team is able to gain. And then finally, multi-stakeholder networks have significant value. Creating whole coalitions of folks has real value. Firstly, the more people included, the more support and assistance a team gets from its scaling work. Secondly, by bringing in resistant or oppositional stakeholders at the beginning, one can attempt productive compromise early on in the process, and in some ways sort of take on some of the predicted challenges before they arise. And then thirdly, diverse perspectives will automatically create equity considerations to be more important. If you're able to bring in diverse coalitions, it requires a kind of inclusive decision-making that will very likely not only strengthen the scaling journey, but make it more equitable. Next slide, please. Another thing that we learned, we found that not all of the scaling teams were fully engaging teachers and local school leaders as authentic scaling partners. Sometimes they saw teachers and other practitioners as simply beneficiaries of the innovation, or people to train and make sure that they're using the innovation with fidelity. But we have seen some real value for those teams that engage the teachers and the local school leaders as authentic scaling partners, not just beneficiaries and not even just as champions. Instead, seeing them as actual partners in the scaling work right from the beginning and engaging them actively as equals carries at least 3 kinds of benefits. It deepens and broadens the support for the innovation and for scaling. It offers the benefit of teacher and other practitioners' input early on in the process. They can talk about what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And I think it's really important to listen to that, because later on it will help with the user uptake and with the scaling of the innovation. And then thirdly, it's got this wonderful spillover benefit where it becomes a teacher professional development experience of its own. I would imagine you all can think of some additional benefits. And if you can come up with some, please put them in the chat. The next slide, please. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about is equity. And the importance of equity here is that for us in the ROSIE project, we define quality education as, by definition, including equity. If an innovation is not reaching everyone in a location, then we don't think that there's been a quality education effort. Sometimes the hardest to reach students are the most important. It's not always cost effective if you're determining cost effectiveness by traditional metrics, but if we really care about quality education, if we really care about offering everyone a good education, equity has to loom large in the process. There are multiple ways to talk about equity. Given the time constraints, I just want to talk for a minute about the importance of prioritizing equity in the research that we do on scaling projects specifically and on scaling as a whole. One of them is that if scaling team researchers are engaged in prioritizing equity, it offers an objective way of determining who's benefiting from an innovation as it's being scaled and who isn't. Secondly, by collecting data around equity considerations and by collecting information on particular subpopulations, it allows us to see the equity effects of innovations and scaling and education reform. And in doing so, it elevates the visibility of the topic. As the topic gets more visibility, it gets more attention. And as it gets more attention, it's a lot easier to find the support and the resources and even the funding to move forward on equity dimensions. But it's hard to prioritize equity if there aren't the data to look closely at it. And so that's a second reason. And then the third reason is that if one isn't paying attention to equity, sometimes as an innovation scales, it will actually replicate the broader inequities in the system rather than disrupt them. And so doing research on that question in particular becomes incredibly important. As I've mentioned before, equity is one of those terms that needs to be defined by a scaling team and its stakeholders. When talking about equity, is one thinking about fitting more people into the existing system, or is it about deconstructing and transforming the system so that it's something else? Is one thinking about equity solely in terms of gender, for example, or maybe thinking about students with learning differences and disabilities, or ethnic minorities, or families in rural locations? There are multiple dimensions of equity, and I think it becomes really important to have these conversations not only at the beginning of the scaling journey, but continually throughout. I know that that was an awful lot to share, but I'd love to stop at this point and maybe offer us some opportunity for some back and forth. And so I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brad. We've had a number of great questions coming into the chat as you've been presenting. So we'll jump in with some of those, and we welcome more questions in the chat as we go. So let's see. First, from Mona Gali, we have the question, what factors are driving the focus on scaling by organizations like IDRC KIX, Brookings, etc.?
I think in some ways I might loop back to what Molly was saying earlier, that we have seen over time that there are an awful lot of really incredible, promising innovations that don't last very long. Either they fail to get implemented, or they're implemented, but then after a short period of time, maybe the funders back away, or the implementing agents leave and move on to something else. And the innovation doesn't stay, it doesn't last, it doesn't become the new normal. And so there was a real movement, I think maybe over a decade ago, to think less about project implementation and education reform as a simple, easy technical process, and instead embrace scaling as a complex, sometimes nonlinear, multi-year process of its own, and to understand that it's an art as much as a science, and it requires really pulling on the best parts of institutions and people and coalitions so that an innovation actually gets built into the location and stands the test of time. I think that has a lot to do with the focus on scaling.
Okay, fantastic. Slightly as a follow-up, but also tracking in a different direction. From Farida in Kyrgyzstan, we have a question wondering if innovations that were piloted many years ago can be scaled up, and what needs to be done, in your opinion, for this.
Right. If I understand that the question about innovations that had been attempted previously, and what might it mean to go back to those and think about scaling them, I think that's a really good point. I think the word innovation is kind of a funny term because if we're not careful, we might prioritize the new things as always being better than the old things. And sometimes there are some really amazing previously built education innovations that we might want to return to and maybe update for the modern time, or maybe build into a system with a little bit more clarity. And so I might think about the notion of an innovation as something that's new to a location, or something that is being taken on in a new way in a location. And so that regard, I think there's real value for thinking about what has already been in existence and maybe has shown promise, and returning to think about what it might mean to scale something like that. Similarly, I think that there's a current popularity in constantly finding innovations that were successful in one location and then moving them or transferring them. I know that Gita writes about this as borrowing and lending, moving them around from place to place. And while I think there's some value in that, there are also a set of concerns about that in terms of how much those innovations might fit in a new location. And I think that there's also a concern that that could obscure the value of homegrown innovations, grassroots innovations that by definition already have local support, that came organically out of a location. And so I'd like to think that we're looking, or at least we should be looking as much as some of those homegrown innovations that already exist, and thinking about what it would mean to validate their effectiveness and work on scaling them, and not only looking to other countries and thinking about what can be moved around from place to place.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Habib Adam, who is wondering about innovation and scaling up in the face of disasters or conflict on education, and how to still successfully achieve this in those contexts.
Such an important point, and I think pertinent now more than ever, arguably. I think one of the things to think about is how great it is that IDRC in this current round of KIX work has got a thematic cohort focused exactly on that. And so we haven't done much work on that thus far, but we expect to learn alongside these KIX teams that are coming in soon to understand where there are similarities and where there are differences in terms of what it means to scale effective innovations in conflict and emergency zones. Where is it different from other kinds of scaling, and where might some of the existing principles still hold true? We hope to find that out in the next couple of years.
Great. And then we're also wondering what approaches towards training and supporting teachers are necessary for the successful scaling of education projects. How might teachers really kind of fit into this bigger picture?
Right. I think there's so many different ways to come at that. One of them is, as I mentioned already, engaging teachers as authentic partners in the scaling process is one way to bring them into the fold. I think that locations themselves need to think about teachers as active professionals, as active change agents who have the ability to participate in the change process in a location. In many locations, and historically, too often teachers have been framed as as passive automatons where an innovation or new training is poured into them and they're supposed to absorb and then simply deliver it in their practice. And for various reasons, that's not true. And it also misses a really important system lever, which is engaging teachers as authentic professionals and working alongside of them to support their own growth and to bring them into the scaling process. It's not that simple, of course. It requires working conditions for teachers being attended to. It requires school leadership. It requires teachers that have some training, that have the kind of competence that allows them to engage in a sort of agentive process. And so it's really a multi-dimensional approach, but I think it's one that deserves an awful lot of attention. That's another aspect of this new round of KIX work, is to bring in a cohort of scaling teams that are focused on teacher professional development and the teacher well-being aspect of scaling and education improvement.
Thank you. We have another great question, two actually that go pretty hand in hand, so I'll ask them together. But from Ratul Chowdhury, they're wondering how to keep the engagement long-term as government champions are susceptible to departmental transfers, and therefore, is it necessary to think about a succession plan, having a +1 with the champions? And similarly, from Wangpo Tenzin, they're then wondering, what are the effective ways of institutionalizing innovations in the systems, given in mind that change is always a challenge?
Yeah, we hear about this a lot and we see it. It's a very common challenge for groups that are hoping to institutionalize their innovation. In other words, work with government to bring the innovation ultimately inside government. How does one handle the inevitable turnover? There are some stock answers here. It depends on the complexity of the situation, but one of them is to think about always having a plan in place for what will happen when there's turnover. A second is to think about making sure to engage some of the folks who are underneath the electoral politic line. In other words, some of the permanent secretaries, some of the technical advisors, those folks who don't come and go with every administration. There's a real value in engaging them because they're going to be around for a while. They have the time to learn about the educational landscape. They have a different set of concerns. I think that's really important. I think the other thing is to always think about how the innovation that one is hoping to scale can connect with shared values of a location, no matter who the administration is. In other words, go fundamentally a little bit deeper than the political priorities, although those are important, but thinking about these sort of shared values underneath the politics. What does it mean to engage education to improve the lives of families and children and educational institutions across the space is something that a lot of people agree with. And so thinking about how to get it at that underlying level sometimes can do it. But I'm not going to suggest that this is easy. We have hear time and time again that a group that's made some real inroads over a year, over 2 years, over 3 years, finds itself having to stop and start all over again with a new administration. And I know that's a real frustration.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Well, thank you. I think we have one more question for Molly, if it's not too much to bring her back and put her on the spot a little bit. And then we'll have her take this question, and then we'll move on to the panel and hopefully allow some time for you to have even more of a conversation in there. Great. So Molly, welcome back. We have a question for you from Sergei Londar in Ukraine. What characteristics of the components of an education system should be taken into account in the first place to hope for successful scaling? How to analyze and evaluate the effect of scaling, and what does a positive effect mean in this case, and how to assess both the short-term and the long-term effects?
Well, this is definitely a big question that I think it won't be possible to answer in detail. But I would say some of the general. So the first part of the question, thinking about the characteristics of the system to analyze. So we talk a lot about, of course, you want to look at the effectiveness of the innovation itself, but then the political, economic, social, and cultural factors in the system that could influence the scaling. So I understand your question is, what might those include? And so I think some, of course, it depends on the system and on the innovation, but if we're looking, for example, at a teacher training initiative, let's say, that could include, looking at how the initiative might be integrated into existing teacher training programs, either pre-service or in-service into the system. I might look at the cost of the new approach and how that might be borne by the system. It might look at the capacity of those in the system to deliver the training, but it might also look at the profile of the teachers maybe that are being recruited and how available that profile might be on a larger scale. Let's say we were able to recruit a certain type of teacher in an urban area. What about in different rural areas? Will that profile be available? If not, will we have to pay the teachers more, bring teachers in? How will that change our scaling plan? And then also factors such as teacher pay, the prestige of the profession, or classroom dynamics. That we found that there are certainly lots of things that can impact how teachers are able to buy into and to deliver an innovation that could influence scaling. So let's say it's an innovation that's really interested in a playful, interactive pedagogy, but the schools have a really strong culture of sort of teachers at the front of the chalkboard. That might impede scaling, but that's a much bigger issue that needs to be addressed and considered. So I think the scope of different considerations, unfortunately, is large and depends on the context and the innovation, but really sort of looking much farther beyond the innovation itself and how it fits into the system, how it might change the system, but how it might also need to be adapted to make sense in the context.
All right, thank you so much. With that, Brad, I think I will turn it over to you and we'll bring our two panelists on and let you move into that section of the program.
Just a quick comment. I see that we were not able to address all of the questions, but I see that a lot of the questions were asking for concrete examples. So experience from countries, experience from collaboration with different countries. So we didn't have a chance to address that, but we will address that now. We will hear from some country examples that Brad will introduce you to just now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marina. And I'm expecting that in a moment, my two panelists will join. If you could forward, there we are. I am delighted and honored to be able to talk with Dr. Gembo Chishering and Dr. Binayak Thapa. Dr. Gembo works at the Royal University of Bhutan. Dr. Binayak works at Kathmandu University. And we did exactly want to offer some concrete examples of what some of these things look like in practice. And so we thought it would be really wonderful to bring in two representatives, each of whom is the principal investigator of one of the ROSIE grantee team, the KIX ROSIE grantee teams in the EMAP region. And so this will give us a chance to talk a little bit about what this looks like in actual practice. And specifically, we wanted to dig a little bit into this notion of what it means to engage champions. And then we also want to talk about data use. I mean, one of the things that I didn't have the time to talk an awful lot about is the importance of collecting data and using data in multiple different ways. There is research to advance the scaling journey itself so that one can adapt and study and learn from the process as it's happening. There's a need to collect and share data with stakeholders, funders, government folks, CSO folks, the beneficiaries, the communities. There's also a need to conduct research and share it writ large with the community so that we continue to build a knowledge base of scaling. There are these and even more reasons for using data and conducting research. And so I'm delighted to have the chance to talk a little bit with Gembo and Binayak. What I suggest we do first is maybe I'll give each of them 2 minutes to introduce their project and to share what the scaling pathway or the scaling strategy of their own project is. And then we'll just talk a little bit about champions and data use. Gembo, maybe I'll begin with you, please.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the KIX EMAP Hub and also the ROSIE team at Brookings University for giving me this opportunity to share my work on the project. So with this, I would like to first share with you what my project is. Our project is called Enhancing Data Utilization and Decision Making in Bhutan's Education System. Monitoring integrated education, motherboard integrated education monitoring and information systems. And we fondly call it as MIMIS abbreviation. So I will refer to this long name by MIMIS. So the MIMIS is managed by Paro College of Education, Royal University of Bhutan, and Drukyalpos Institute. Both the institutes are in Bhutan. And the MIMIS objectives are to generate evidence-based insights, enhance stakeholder capacity, mobilize knowledge and evidence, foster partnerships, and address gender equity and inclusion issues in Bhutanese education system. The MIMIS overall expectations are to foster a culture of data use, promote GI awareness, enhance data systems and infrastructure, and facilitate knowledge transfer among the stakeholders, including the international stakeholders. Then now, what are the scaling pathways that we are using or planning to use as our project progresses to realize its big aim, as shared earlier, are we will use scaling out its pathway by increasing the beneficiary base and training MIMIS stakeholders across Bhutan. Next, we will also use scaling up pathway by exploring data interoperability with different systems used by different government agencies. So we have different agencies using different systems of data management. So we would like to explore through this project how this interoperability can be enhanced. And finally, we will also do deep scaling, scaling deep by integrating IMIS and motherboard systems to produce quantitative and qualitative student performance and growth data. So as of now, we have two systems. One is the IMIS system, which is basically producing quantitative data. And the other one is the motherboard system, which is producing qualitative data. So we want to integrate this as part of our scaling deep approach of our MIMIS project. Thank you, Professor Brett.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Binayak, would you mind spending a moment and share with us your project and the scaling pathways you all are pursuing or considering to pursue?
Thank you, Brad, and giving me this opportunity to speak about my project. And thank you, EMAP Hub, for organizing this event. Well, our project is about promoting gender equality and social inclusion in public schools in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan. We actually take a departure from regular gender equality and social inclusion promotion that is through and by building on what students value and aspire to do and be. Basically, our project is considering to create a gender equality and social inclusion diagnosis tool, which we feel and assume that if we have a proper GESI diagnosis within a school system, we would be able to have evidences that would really correctly inform on better changes that is required for promoting gender equality and social inclusion. Having that purpose of this project, our scaling pathway is basically to target or to contribute towards behavioral change, change in certain type of practices, or even cultivating needed soft skills among students by the teachers, where we would use different kinds of engagements and innovations needed in our scaling journey towards catering to the needs of promoting GESI through awareness, having sensitive and responsive curriculum design, as well as targeting what type of transformation we can actually bring about in students' daily practices, so that they have a better lived gender equality and social inclusion experiences within the school. So having that as a scaling pathway, our project basically tries to see scaling in two forms. One is, to what extent can we actually diagnose this scaling, and in what ways we can deepen the impact that the project will have after a needful intervention is done towards promoting gender equality and social inclusion in school, Brad.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you both a question. Maybe in a way it's a two-part question, and this will give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about champions. You heard me talk a little bit about champions already. I'd like to ask you both, and maybe we'll start with you, Gembo, and then go ahead, Vinayak, you can follow up. How do you define champions for scaling? And how are you identifying and engaging champions for your work?
Thank you, Professor Brett. I would like to share your definition of champions, scaling champions. To us, our local and international policymakers, prominent individuals, funders, NGOs, or community leaders who become committed to an initiative that's our MEMIS and wish for it to be adopted and sustained at a large scale throughout the system. These champions are knowledgeable, credible, determined, and connected individuals with the vision, skills, and positioning to motivate others, foster increased commitment, and potentially secure resources to move innovation from concept to adoption for scale in our education system. So this is the concept of champions we have among my team. And now how we identify and engage these champions. So based on these champions, we have used what is called popularly known as power interest matrix to identify our champions. So our MEMIS stakeholders have different powers and interests. I mean, champions with different powers and interests. So we have stakeholders with high power to influence the MEMIS and low interest. We have stakeholders with high power and high interest. We have stakeholders with low power and low interest. And we have stakeholders with low power and high interest. So among these four groups of champions, we are focusing on stakeholders with high power and high interest. And that is probably, it will come later, who they are. So, but at the same time, we consider stakeholders with high power and high interest, our champions. Of course, we also keep all stakeholders in the MEMIS loop, because they are somehow or the other related, despite the variations in their power to influence our project, and also carry on, continue with our recommendations, and at the same time, their variation in interest in our project. But despite the differences, we feel that we have to keep all of them in loop. So this is how we identify our champions. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you. And Gembo, could you share with us an example of a high power, high interest champion? Maybe not necessarily the name, but the role or the type of champion that fits that in your context.
Yes, so our country, Bhutan, has a strong inclination towards having a digital environment, and the groundwork is already there in terms of infrastructure, the connectivity, and all this. And the successive governments have come up with a series of flagship programs to facilitate digitization in the country or of the country. So therefore, this educational management and information systems is also growing together with this much of attention coming from the government side. And particularly the Ministry of Education and Skills Development has been paying very high interest and attention to this system through continuous maintenance and also improvement. So therefore, our project to have the outcomes or the impact of our project going at a scale, the Ministry of Education and Skill Development is the champion with high power and high interest in our
Wonderful.
project.
Thank you. Yeah, very helpful and very clear. Thank you. Vinayak, maybe we'll turn to you and ask, I'd like to ask the same question to begin. How do you define champions for scaling, and how are you all identifying and engaging them within your work?
You see, Brad, every project has its own peculiar and particular scaling journey. Within this journey, where it's from the beginning, we encounter our project's need. That in saying that, we would definitely see that we are extra resources that is coming in. Sometimes we need a better connection and networking for communication and knowledge exchange. That's part of our projects. Sometimes we need expertise from people, experienced people, to help us. And these are the different ways in which we feel that, a particular champion can actually contribute to us or whomever we have identified as. Therefore, for me, in simple words, champions would be those people who would be resourceful and would be able to, or is ready to at least, contribute certain resources to my scalability, if at all I can convince them. The other is there are certain champions who can actually help me network or help me use their network or get me connected such that it helps me in my scaling journey. The others could be just about having expertise and experiences, right? That would basically be contribution to my journey of scaling. So putting it simple, resource, networking and connection, expertise and experiences are the qualities that I would look at in a champion. Now, towards identifying my champions, one thing is I definitely would have to acknowledge your Brookings institution. In previous project, we used this tool called as mapping the scaling system. Technically, we were looking at who could be potential initiators and enablers. These was one of those tools that really helped us identify our champions. It could be a fusion of initiators as well as enablers that in your scaling journey that you would like to or would be identifying certain champions there. Now in that, this was a really helpful tool. And again, we are using this tool for this new project in terms of identifying those who could help us promote gender equality and social inclusion in schools. While we talk about then identification, when done, we are now interested in engaging with them. Almost every project would definitely be having a stakeholder mapping done. This is a common practices. We fused mapping scaling system and stakeholders mapping. So that was one thing that we did. A second is that having now the stakeholders mapping, we would want to also have a stakeholder engagement plan. And as rightly Dr. Gambo put it, you have priorities of stakeholders in terms of its importance. How regularly you would want to get connected with them, who are your immediate and who are at the background. While doing that, we would also have a stakeholder engagement plan, and we actually use this stakeholders engagement plan after the stakeholder mapping or mapping scaling system, and see that how do we connect with them, and what are the different processes that we or activities we take up to engage with our particular champions.
Thank you. If you don't mind a follow-up, I'm interested in what kinds of challenges you've either encountered or predict in terms of engaging those champions and how you might take on or address those challenges. Vinayak, that's for you. Have you encountered some challenges, or do you predict some? And if so, what are they and how might you address those?
Yeah, definitely. You see, when I say that when we have identified certain champions or we have certain engagement plan, our project have actually identified different champions at different level, and therefore our challenges would also be at different levels. Like, for example, in my project, which is basically uh, aiming at a municipality level, I have 4 different type of champions, like the mayor, who is going to be the topmost, like Gambo says, the most powerful there and the most influential. Then, and that person is ready to give me resources if he buys in my innovation. Secondly is convincing the education officer there at the municipality level. He is a person who could provide me networking and communication. He has the resources to get connected with the different schools that is there. And expertise and experiences are with head teachers and the teachers who are responsible towards scaling the agenda that we have put in. Now, the basic challenges that we tend to see is very first is how do we convince these levels of champions or people who are also looked upon as gatekeepers towards buying of our innovation. We really need to convince them to accept, give us access, help us adapt to their particular local realities. Help us at least replicate if we have evidences that our innovation is going to work, and therefore equally accept and engage with us in terms of adapting to local reality and trying to connect with their local contexts. Put that into practice and bring about change. That is what we see and we aim for. That would help our students to have some type of behavioral change. But at the end, the biggest and I guess the foremost difficulty is on sustainability, as well as recurring investments, whether it may be of resources or of time or of interest. And that goes on to the locals taking the ownership of our intervention, as well as acting for sustainability for future progress.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'd like to make sure that we leave some time at the end for closing comments, and I'm also hoping that we might have a few minutes for the two of you to take on some of the questions that are coming up. So I'm just going to ask one more question of each of you, and I'm going to turn to data use and research, something that's incredibly important in scaling processes. I'll ask each of you, maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Gembo, what is one specific audience that you hope to or that you are currently targeting with data use? Who is that audience and what kind of data do you expect to offer them?
Thank you, Brett. Our project, as it is about enhancing data use by using the educational information management system, obviously the target, the top target is the Ministry of Education and Skills Development. And also the system is designed to be of service to the users. So down the line, all the other stakeholders will be the users. So somehow or the other, they have to use it. And how the system is user-friendly, how reliable the outcomes that are coming out of the system is, will be the kind of central point that will guide the collection of our data. And therefore, our data will come in 2 forms. One is quantitative data, and the other one is qualitative data. So the quantitative data about the system will focus on the quality of data that is going on into the system, EMIS system, and the motherboard system. And that part of the data will in fact facilitate the Ministry of Education and Skills Development, for that matter, the Royal Government of Bhutan, to even benchmark and establish kind of baseline data, baseline data or benchmarks for the EMIS against around 110 countries that took part in the benchmarking process conducted by the World Bank Institutes in 2014. With that in place, it would be easier for the government to even present their case for sustainable funding even after our project is long gone. So that's how we try to do that with the qualitative data, the quantitative part of the data. And with the qualitative part of the data, we want to connect through this project with the users, the first-hand users, and see how they are comfortable using and whether they are getting the type of information they want to get from the image. So we want to see that and then have those data put together to bring changes. And during our project lifetime itself, we would come up with some interventions focusing on hands-on training. And then there will be lots of recommendations that will be coming out of the project, which will then become areas of explorations in the future by the Ministry of Education and Skills Development and other stakeholders to enhance the serviceability of the EMIS. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Binayak, I'll turn to you. Your your innovation is focused on gender equity and social inclusion. So could you talk about one specific audience that you are targeting with a kind of data, and what data are you using to generate support for that one particular audience?
Brad, probably my answer for this will be a little bit complicated, but connecting with the examples that I gave before. The research that we are doing is totally influenced by participatory action research. Therefore, we would be including different participants at different levels. Particularly if you see, we would want to use this methodology, but at the same time, we are also wanting to do a diagnosis, that is gender equality and social inclusion diagnosis tool. But this diagnosis tool is going to be created by the participation of the immediate beneficiaries as well as users of this. And this basically is going to give us a tool for which we are going to do pre and post test, and then think about what are the rightful innovations that we want to improve or promote gender equality and social inclusion. In that regards, we would be having, at levels, we would be having, our audience. One would be definitely the municipal people. That's the head, the municipality head, municipal education officer. Similarly, we would also be interacting with the school head as well as the teachers who are involved or giving us, feedback and participating in our journey to create the diagnosis tool. And once the diagnosis is done, again, we go back at them and actually, give them the results. And then we again engage them back again so that we can get them together for improving or getting along with the innovations that we have designed. Therefore, within this pre-test, post-test, as well as the tool that we are going to generate, Jesse, the different approaches that we are intending to use. One is the intersectionality approach. Secondly, when we are using or collecting data, the analysis is going to be with disaggregated data. Definitely a public school here in Nepal, or at least in rural areas, would be engaging with students or having students from marginalized community, the excluded groups, the poor income persons. And therefore, we go by analyzing through age, gender, class, as well as ability to see that and see which section is basically benefiting. And at the same time, then see what different combination of different section benefits differently.
And would you mind sharing with us a little bit about this diagnostic tool? Is this a set of survey instruments, focus groups, interviews?
This is supposed to be a survey instrument, the tool basically. But prior to this tool, we engage in focus group discussion, participatory workshops towards designing indicators for the survey instrument. And now who are involved? The teachers, the students, both different boys and girls of different ages, done or included in different focus group discussions with different episodes of rounds of interviews. And we try to see what exactly are their experiences of gender equality and social inclusion in their own terms. What are the different experiences within the school that they feel that they values? And if it is valuable, that needs to be promoted such that there's a better promotion of gender equality and social inclusion for the children. And that's why we say that we depart from a normal support or promotion of gender equality, which probably could be based on from a very objective point of view. But right now we are taking the students' views and their voices to craft a gender equality and social inclusion diagnosis tool.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, Dr. Gembo, Dr. Benayak, thank you so much for your really thoughtful responses and for your perspectives. I think it really nicely offered a concrete counterweight to some of the more abstract things that we were talking about earlier. I'm going to turn things over to Marina now. I have a feeling, I haven't been monitoring the chat, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are a ton of interesting questions, and I sure wish we had time for them, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. Marina, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Brad. Yes, we had a few comments and questions coming up in the chat. Unfortunately, time is a little bit short, but I could see that a lot of them were referring to the interests in the tools you're referring to, and any suggested resources and tools related to the discussions we had today. For me, it is an interesting segue to say that we are ready in discussion with the ROSIE team to organize a workshop following up from this discussion today that will most likely take place in the fall. So for all participants that are interested in engaging a little bit deeper in the topic, please keep an eye in the communications from the hub, in the different email communications we'll send you, and also on our website. As soon as we announce the dates, you're going to be hearing a bit more about that workshop. And let me also take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers today. I think it was really, really useful and interesting discussion for everyone here in the room. And we could really see a very good connection between the insights that Molly and Brad were sharing regarding the ROSIE research and what is being seen across different research projects within KIX, and then going into the specific application of some of these insights to the projects. So it was really, really good to hear the examples from Bhutan, from Nepal, and to be able to see how these challenges and opportunities in scaling are taking place in practice. So thank you very much for that, for sharing a bit of your experience and knowledge with the audience. And let me also thank all of those that were sharing comments, questions in the chat. I think we had a very engaging discussion in the chat as well. And let me tell you that this is just the beginning. This is a very interesting topic for all of us. I think this community is really about making sure everything we are doing in education is having that impact, is making sure it's equitable and impactful for all the education systems. So this is a key topic that we'll continue exploring. Of course, always looking forward to further collaborations with the ROSIE project to learn about their learnings, to learn about the emerging insights that this research is coming through, and also through the research projects in KIX. With that, let me tell you that we also have some upcoming activities in KIX. So we are closing this webinar also with a request for you to disseminate information about 2 learning cycles that we are organizing. Both of these learning cycles are starting in September. And they will be, they have applications closing on 16th of August. So you have almost 2 weeks to apply for these 2 learning cycles. Let me briefly tell you what they are about. So we have one learning cycle that will be focusing on increasing women's representation in school leadership. And we have another learning cycle focusing on secondary teacher workforce management. So applications are open. My colleagues will share the link in the chat. And I encourage you all to please have a look if this is relevant to your work. And if it's not closely related to what you're doing, please disseminate information for others in your context who would be suitable to contribute and to benefit from these knowledge exchange, experience, and also professional developments. With that, let me also tell you that we are always willing to learn how we can do better in our work. And one of the tools that we have for that is our post-event survey. So we'll be sharing with you the links now. Oh, we have that in the screen with the QR codes as well. So please let us know how we can improve. What were your key takeaways of these events as well? And just to say that this is also an opportunity for you to tell us what would you like to learn more about in this topic. So as we are designing future activities on the topic of scaling and including the workshop I was referring to, this is also a channel for you to tell us what will be the key topics and tools that you would like to learn about. With that, let me thank once again to the ROSIE team and also to our two speakers from Bhutan and from Nepal for sharing their valuable expertise with us today. And we look forward to continue engaging and collaborating with you in the future. Thanks, everyone.